Hello again, this is Michael Hicks from Business Administration 602. This is our economics review. In the previous review, we talked about the statistical work, and I'll get to that as we go along. The economics review here provided some basic information that you'll need in classes. And I'm really going to focus in the later material, the supply and demand and the cost model. But I wanted you to see what we did in this class. And these are graphics that come right out of the OpenStax open source textbook that we used in the class. So I started out talking about economic models, the use of assumptions in economic models, and the importance of simplicity. I talked about this production possibilities frontier graphic very quickly, and I talked about areas that were, why it's convex, at what point we can and cannot produce, and at what point which we can produce, and what's the opportunity cost of moving along that curve. So I presented those. And then I talked about, in short order, supply and demand. And what I have here is a demand curve, right, that shows the combination of price and quantity consumed in the market for gasoline. I drew it without benefit of all those actual numbers, simply because this is available in the textbook and I wanted to focus on theory. Note the law of demand describes a downward sloping demand curve. The factors that shift demand here, I'm sorry, this is not supply, but demand, right, are the number of buyers, the income of consumers, taste and preferences of consumers, and the price of related goods. These are complements with an E and substitutes. I then introduced the supply curve, and again I did it theoretically without benefit of gallons of gasoline or the price per gallon, just to showing the response that producers have in the supply curve, which is really what this is. The demand curve tells us what consumers do, the supply curve tells us what producers do, and the factors that affect supply are the numbers of sellers, the costs of inputs of production, and the technology available to reduce. I also noted that expectations affect both supply and demand in these markets. So consumers who expect price to drop are going to withhold buying until the price drops. If they expect the price to go up, they will buy it earlier. The reverse is true with producers. If producers expect the price to go up, they're going to want to hold off on selling until the price rises. If they expect the price to drop, they're going to want to sell them now as quickly, and these two play off one another. I then introduced the idea of market equilibrium. And market equilibrium occurs when the demand curve and the supply curve are at an equal point here, $1.40 a gallon and 600 million gallons sold. If the price were $1.20 a gallon, there would be more demanded. Here, in this case, 700 gallons, where there's a much lower level of gasoline that sellers would be able to offer. Likewise, if the price were artificially raised to $1.80 a gallon, there would be a lot more producers wanting to sell it at that price, but fewer consumers willing to pay that price of it. So excess supply happens when there's a forced above equilibrium price, like a minimum wage or a minimum price sale, and then underneath this as a price floor, a price ceiling, which is a maximum price that can be charged. And I emphasized that the difference between quantity demand and quantity supplied, and said this would be a concept that many of you would fail. So the movement along the demand curve is called quantity demanded. The shifting of the demand curve is called a change in demand. Same thing with the supply curve, which I haven't illustrated. The supply curve is upward sloping. The movement along the supply curve is called a change in quantity supplied. The movement of the supply curve, the shifting of the right, is called a change in quantity supplied. So here's an example. I went through the shifting of demand curve. If there's a shift to greater popularity of the product, population goes up, income rises for most goods, price of substitute goes up, price of complements falls, or there's future expectations, all cause the demand curve to shift to the right. the change the other way cause them to shift to the left. And always focus on changing to the right or left, otherwise you're apt to be confused with it. At the same time, we have supply curves here. The factors that increase supply would be favorable conditions for production. I don't know, that's not often used. Lower input prices, better technology, lower taxes or regulation, and more sellers really cause this to be the case. And the reverse is true in quantity supplied. And then I would give you an example of one of these shifting, and you would make your own determination whether or not it was a demand or supply side effect given these, and come up with a new equilibrium. And that's really the crux of the supply and demand questions that would appear on an examination, is this solving of supply and demand. I then went into elasticity. Recall that I said elasticity existed in a range. We usually don't care about signs because elasticity of demand is always negative. Elasticity of supply is always positive. Just think about this in terms of absolute value. If the absolute value of elasticity is 0, we have a perfectly inelastic product. If the change in quantity is less than the change in price, we have an inelastic demand for this product. If it's proportional, so 1%, and so in the inelastic example, if the price rose by 1%, if sales drop by less than 1%, that's the inelastic range. If price didn't vary at all, as in the graphic, if price went up by 1% and sales didn't change at all, then we'd have a perfectly inelastic demand curve we see in the bottom right of this picture right here. We have a point of unit elasticity, and that is where if there's a 1% change in price, there's a offsetting 1% change in quantity. And then finally, we have the elastic range, where a 1% change in price would cause more than a 1% loss in quantity sold. So there's always going to be an inelastic, a unit, and an elastic area of demand. It can be perfectly elastic and perfectly inelastic. Perfectly inelastic would be, for example, insulin or crack cocaine. The price changes within a normal range don't change much about the consumption of those two items. And then perfectly elastic demand curve would be something like a commodity for corn. So if I'm creating biofuel and somebody tries to, I'm always only going to pay the market price for corn if it goes up by a penny, and somebody's unwilling to sell it at the commodity price, I will demand none if they're good. And so those are the elasticity considerations that are important. We didn't do any estimation with that. I then went on to discuss cost curves, and I did more detail than is available here, but I noted we had a fixed cost curve that it became an average fixed cost, which is not illustrated here, which once it's an average is actually the distance between the average total cost, here labeled average cost, and the average variable cost, and that there's a marginal cost. And I didn't talk about profit zone and break-even point. I saved that for the next portion of the class, which is the competitive spectrum. And I said we would have, the competitive spectrum had assumptions in our model. Many firms are, in the case of perfect competition, an infinite number of firms, infinite number of buyers as well, identical product and perfect information. As we saw, fewer firms, less identical product, maybe fewer buyers. We got into monopolistic competition. Here we might say 12 or 8 or 9 firms, from infinite down to 8 competing in the same market. Fewer firms might be 2 firms that are constrained geographically, so fast food restaurant in a town that's a long ways from any other towns, that would be an oligopoly. And oligopoly, when we go from monopolistic competition to oligopoly, we trigger a point where firms care more about other firms' behavior than they do consumers directly. So in perfect competition, I don't really care about what other firms are doing. I'm a farmer, or I'm selling bulk copper. I don't really care about what other firms are doing in terms of their efforts to market or price their product. I really worry about myself and my consumers. I may learn from them, but I'm not changing my price based on their pricing of their product. When I get into monopolistic competition, all I'm really doing is changing the quality of the product that I offer. So, men's shirts are monopolistic competition. I don't really care about price. I may care about my consumer, other firms competing on the type of product that they sell, but it's still a fairly competitive market. And when I get to oligopoly, when I'm talking about just a few firms, well, that's a very different environment. Now I'm worried more deeply about the other firms' pricing characteristics, and so that makes a difference. And then finally there's monopoly, where I'm really worried just about one firm. And so a firm in perfect competition is going to look like this. They're going to have a flat marginal revenue or demand curve. In my example, I also showed that counterpoise to the market itself. Then I have I have the average cost curve and a marginal cost curve. And this happens to show a firm with a profit here. Recall that the perfectly competitive firm then could have entrants. Other firms would enter the market, squeeze out that profit, and we would return that marginal revenue curve would then be down beneath down at the minimum of the average total cost curve. And that market entrance and exit is that's what causes equilibrium in competitive markets. Without entrance and exit, you don't have price moving to equilibrium. In fact, in monopoly, which is the extreme end of this market, we have no entrance. So we assume that barriers to entry are driving most of the constraint to trade, and that's really what's driving this market. So we have here a demand curve, we have a marginal revenue curve, which can actually go negative. We have a marginal cost curve and an average cost curve. These are the same as above, but they're just flattened out more. And you can see that all firms are going to set, profit maximization. Marginal revenue is equal to marginal cost, right? And so here, marginal revenue equals the marginal cost gives us the quantity. That's 5 units that they're going to produce, and that price of that product. And this area between the cost curve at that $5 and the demand curve where they're pricing, well, that's the monopoly profits that are available at that point. And then the cost of producing is this area down here. And so that's really where I ended my discussion of the economics of this class. For our last lecture, I will go through the practice exam, which I'll do midweek next week. I'll pass out the practice exam this week, and that will give you a chance to look at it, to listen to it, and then to take the final exam. Thank you.